Hi guys, my name is Per Wolfesberg and I'm going to be talking to you about the Endangered Species Act and how and why we need to revise it. So some background, the ESA was signed into law by President Richard Nixon on December 28, 1973, and since then over 2,200 plants and animals have been listed and only 2% have been recovered to the point where they could be delisted or taken off the list, Endangered Species Act. It gives federal agencies authority to list a species as threatened or endangered, and these agencies are the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which holds jurisdiction over land and freshwater, and the National Marine Fisheries Services, which holds jurisdiction of marine habitat. 95% of the listed species are under the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Species become listed via scientific study conducted by one of the services, and this can also be brought to the attention of the services by a petition from an individual like you or me or an organization. The services must establish a recovery plan, and this plan goes by the 3 R's. The first R would be resiliency. So a species must have high populations and lots of genetic diversity and age variation. Redundancy, multiple separate populations, and representation, genetic diversity to adapt to changing environments if needed. So the main issues with the Endangered Species Act are, the first one is that the recovery plan is not required to be researched or implemented shortly after listing. This means that sometimes a species get listed and it can take months or years for a recovery plan to be established. Because it's not required of the agencies, it doesn't become a priority. The next one will be that the ESA does not cooperate well with landowners and stakeholders. So if a species gets listed, the agencies must determine critical habitat. So CHDs would be critical habitat designations, and this can cross onto land that is privately owned, or it can go onto land that has been previously used for economic activity, public land that's used for logging or public land that's used for ranching, for example. This has led to a phenomenon called shoot, shovel, shut up, where landowners may find a endangered species on their land, and just like I said, shoot, shovel, shut up. They don't want the agencies to come in and change the rules and regulations of how the land is used because this species uses their land as habitat. So the ESA needs to work or cooperate better with landowners and stakeholders of public lands. Another problem would be insufficient and inefficient spending. The amount spent on recovery plans in the last 15 years is a third of what's been required, and 5% of the listed species receive 80% of funds. Critical habitat designations are extremely expensive. The cost for bull trout CHDs are $75 million a year, and orcas $24 million a year. And there are currently 35 species listed every year, and there's just not enough funds to support all that. If they cooperate with landowners, going back to the other point, to develop conservation plans with landowners rather than list a species and spend money on CHDs, they can save a lot of money and spend their money properly in other ways. This has been shown cooperating with landowners and stakeholders. In multiple examples, one of them would be with bull trout. In Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana, millions of acres were excluded from critical habitat designations because stakeholders, logging companies primarily, developed their own conservation plans. The ESA or federal agencies should do this more often to save money. So the issue of politics is pretty complicated, but conservation organizations, or so-called conservation organizations, will sue the delisting of a species and win a settlement. So, for example, this has been outlined extremely in the wolf situation, where agencies want to delist the wolf, take it off the Endangered Species Act, and turn management over to the states. And conservation organizations will sue this delisting, take it to court, and the federal agencies will have to spend a lot of their money on settlements with these conservation organizations. A lot of money that should be spent on saving animals rather than on lawsuit settlements. So for improvements, I believe a bill needs to be introduced to amend the Endangered Species Act. One thing that should be on there is that a recovery plan must be required soon after listing. If a recovery plan isn't working, some new options need to be explored and need to be changed, the recovery plan, and that's because right now 50% of listed species are on the decline. Allocation of funds, 5% of listed species should not be receiving 80% of the funds. That needs to be changed and made more fair. The ESA should cooperate with landowners and stakeholders first and foremost. I gave the example of the bull trout. Another example is the Gunnison sage grouse, where ranchers developed a conservation plan to save the sage grouse rather than have it go on the Endangered Species Act, because they were afraid that if it did, they would lose their ability to summer their cattle on public land. But the fact that they were scared into doing that, creating that conservation plan, the federal agencies should have come in and cooperated rather than threatening to list the Gunnison sage grouse. To solve the politics problem, when a species reaches the stated goals, it must be delisted and have the management handed over to the states. That was like with the wolf problem. It reached the stated goals in the mid-2000s, but because so many so-called conservation organizations were gaining so much money off of settlements in court over suing the agencies for wanting to delist the wolf, that it took till 2011 for management of the wolf to be handed over to state agencies. So the costs of this would be the cost of an ad campaign, a social media ad campaign that would garner public support to amend the Endangered Species Act, and this would cost anywhere in the range of $5 to $20 million, depending on the Department of Interior and the service's desire and the amount of funding that they want to spend on this. However, there are many hunter-based conservation organizations and foundations that support more state control of wildlife rather than federal control, and they will advertise heavily at no additional cost. It's hard to measure the amount that they will support in terms of social media, but it'll be a lot considering how many there are, and I'll name a few in a minute. So for feasibility, David Bernhardt is the Secretary of the Department of the Interior, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Services can write a bill to amend the ESA. For an ad campaign, feasibility of that, all those platforms are already in place. And the movement to amend the ESA can start within the services of the Department of the Interior. They know that those problems are there, and they can decide to go about making an amendment, or they can be motivated by a petition or a grassroots movement. So, as I stated before, there was all those hunter-based conservation organizations and foundations that are going to support this amendment of the Endangered Species Act, and I'll just list a few here. One would be Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, National Rifle Association, Boone and Crockett Club, Pope and Young Club, North American Bear Foundation, North American Grouse Partnership, National Trappers Association, and dozens more. And I believe that millions of citizens who might originally oppose this amendment or believe falsified ad campaigns will lend their support once they understand the problems with the ESA and why it needs to be amended and how it's really not as successful as it should be. So these are my sources, and if you want to look at the rest of those conservation organizations and foundations that would support this, click on the link. This starts with Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation.